President Trump has appointed Vice President Vance to remove from the Smithsonian Institute the anti-American improper ideology. What is that? It's over. The empire is on its way down. In that moment, Donald Trump says, I'm going to take back the Panama Canal. I'm going to take Greenland away from Denmark. I'm going to take Canada away from the Canadian. When your country is falling apart, one of the ways you hold it together is to go on a crusade. And the working class is hit in too many ways. It's upset, it's angry, it doesn't see a way out. That's a description of the German working class. That's why it went with Hitler.
Today, I would like to talk about the decline of the American empire. This is a very provocative question, but first I want to say, whether you love Trump or hate Trump, though this more applies to people who hate Trump, I think it's just absolutely ridiculous to say that he's Hitler or he's as bad as Hitler when you look at what Hitler did versus what Trump has done. It's just crazy.
Agreed.
I still think it's a very interesting historical exercise to ask what parallels you see between Trump and Hitler as people, maybe in their rises to power, their regimes.
That's not the kind of reasoning I do. It's just, I don't believe in it. It makes no sense to me. What's interesting is not these individuals, neither of them.
Because Trump is irrelevant, as we spoke about before.
Yeah, it's the situation. What he does is made by his circumstances, not by him. He is really, in a long chain of causation, he's the last step. He's not the first step. He's not even in the middle. He's trying to cope with 27 pressures coming in at him in different ways. And if I knew more about him, I might make an educated guess which way he's going to go. But I don't. I'm not about to know him. I don't even care very much. I'm interested in the forces and how they are pushing him. Which way he finally goes, I can't know. And it's kind of idle speculation. The reason the German story is important is it gives you some sense of some of the pressures he's under. You've got a working class here that is very shocked. No one prepared them. That's a flaw of this culture, which of course no one is allowed to say. No one prepared them that there is an empire, that the empire is going to decline. Why? Because every empire in the world has. And do you really want to bet that this one won't? And if it might, could it be now? Could we? We cannot have that conversation. We just had a presidential election in which neither candidate said a word like that. Not Trump, not Biden, not Harris. Not declining empire? Us? Who? Me? Not at all. They all talk as though we're deciding on doing it. We're the United States and we're making decisions. And look at Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump, in a world in which probably it is fair to say the overwhelming majority of people are coming out of a century or two of colonialism, hating it, wanting it to disappear. Anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism is the ethos of the world at this point. Why would a leader now, even the ethos I just described, having attacked Russia for 3 years relentlessly for taking Ukraine, territory in Ukraine, suddenly become the advocate of taking territory? What the hell? What? But now, wait a minute. Now you do have an answer. when your country is falling apart, one of the ways you hold it together is to go on a crusade. Hitler attacks everybody. It's crazy. How is Germany going to fight Russia, Poland, the West? What are you, nuts? Yeah, afterwards, that's how we talk. But at the time, he's solving problems. Step by step, and his rationale is kind of, if you look at it honestly, I don't like Hitler, obviously. Most of my family was killed by the fellow, not his part. But I understand what he was doing. I understand what Mr. Trump is doing. I think the usefulness of the exercise is to learn something from understanding it, to be more strategically adept at avoiding the worst outcome. Hitler, Trump is no Hitler. I got that. I agree with you about that. But he's under pressures that in one case led in that direction, and there are sure as hell signs that in this case, there are also some of them leading in that direction. Will they be strong enough? Will they engender a counter-reaction? Who knows? Germany, at the time Hitler takes power, had extremely well-organized, very powerful left wing. Half the country were in the socialist or communist parties. These were parties that had armed detachments to fight in the streets, and they were disciplined in many ways, particularly the Communist Party of Germany. Our left is out to lunch. There are no organizations even remotely comparable. Is it therefore easier for fascism to come here in some ways? You bet. You bet. If and when Mr. Trump, he hasn't done it yet, but if and when Mr. Trump were to mobilize his partisans, the Proud Boys, folks like that, put them in a uniform the way that Hitler did, and have them terrorize anybody who has a meeting, to get rid of the un-American, improper ideology. Now it's a Smithsonian. Tomorrow it'll be what? A rally in Times Square? We already are picking up people whose crime seems to have been that they participated in anti-Israel or pro-Palestinian activities at various universities. The universities are caving, giving the names to the police, abetting the whole process. Colombia, beyond words. Okay, those are signs. I think it is as inappropriate to equate Hitler to Trump as it is not to see that Trump is under very similar pressures and is making some similar moves. That's as much as it's reasonable to say. But it's unreasonable to deny that. I wish it weren't the case. Secretary of State Rubio made a speech yesterday in which he made it clear, I'm boasting. 300 foreign students, that was the number he gave, have been expelled from the United States, have had their visas canceled or withdrawn. People in the middle of their PhD studying such revolutionary topics as, oceanography and so forth. Well, but it turns out that they wrote an article about genocide in Gaza or something like that. Jesus, that's interesting. It's interesting that people who come here and participate in nonviolent, perfectly legal political expression, which is not an excluded activity by anybody, are now being able, and that nothing is happening. Nothing is happening. Very few people saying much about it. The Democratic Party is DOA. It's not even there. Mr. Biden seems to have vanished into thin air. Kamala Harris with him. This is for me, by the way, you're heading into the greatest crisis the Democratic Party has had in a long time. The progressive wing of that party, it cannot continue much longer the way it has. And that's, they may not recover. I can't tell you the number of people that have contacted me talking about new parties, third party. I mean, it's off the chart. That doesn't prove or guarantee anything, but it is an interesting phenomena coming out of this situation. And even the Republican Party may not be able to. You can see senators already over this, what are they calling it? Signal gate, are beginning to split inside the Republicans, because those who see this as another Watergate and they want to get on the right side early, and those who don't want to. But here's the punchline, take us back. These are all signs of a declining empire. That's all of this. All of this. Trump as a phenomena. This is a society that somewhere in some way understands that the convenient oscillation of the last 70 years, a Democrat, a Republican, as president, you do your stint and you turn it over to the other one, and the same at the Senate, and the same at the House, and it doesn't make all that much difference. It's enough of a difference, little, that half the people don't bother voting. They don't see any point in it. They don't regret it when they don't vote, because we know 2 years later, 4 years later, they don't vote again. All right? This was a very, the Germans have a wonderful word, gemütlich. I don't know how that translates into English, gemütlich. Pleasant, comfortable, relaxed, tranquil, words like that. Mr. Trump is the end of that. Mr. Trump had nothing. He didn't come up through the ranks. He didn't learn the political game. He wasn't like so many of you. Look at Kamala Harris. She was a DA. She was a senator. She learns. Biden. He was a senator from Delaware. And Bush's world. Mr. Trump comes out of what's his skill? He's good at being a playboy in New York City, going to clubs with his father's money. It's charming, it's fine, who cares? But and he's brash, and he says things you're not supposed to, and he acts, he doesn't fit. That's why he get treated badly, and now he's angry and getting back and revenge against all of it. It's a play. Shakespeare could have written this. It's a play. It's the odd president. But that tells you something. And that is that the system can't go on. That's why when he first starts, he rides down an escalator and tells us all how Mexicans are rapists. What? No politician would do that. That's nuts. But it was the ticket to success. Because everything is different now. And being your reasonable Bush, Clinton is, the same old doesn't fly. And by the way, I can assure you, since I'm closer to the Democratic Party than I am, of course, to the Republican, is that among the Democrats that I talk to, they are more troubled than I've ever seen them. They don't know what to do. And I know people pretty high up in that structure. They really don't know what to do. They know that Bernie is kind of out of the picture. He's too old. But they're coming up, lots of them, all over the place. and they understand that if you look at the voting, if you look at the young people particularly, this has got to go. And especially now, if you look at the economic program that Mr. Trump is putting forward, it's nuts. You can't, I liken it to this. And by now you have a sense of how my head reasons. The best image for Mr. Trump's economic policy is from football. You know what a Hail Mary pass is? That's his policy. His policy is a Hail Mary pass. It's when the game is nearly lost and you've got only enough seconds for one more play. So you tell your receivers, I want you all to go out and go over in the left-hand corner of the field, close to the end zone, but not yet. I'm going to heave the ball there. There's going to be 3 of you and 3 defenders, and you're all going to go for the ball, and it's going to bounce around, and hopefully it'll come down in your hands, and then we win the game. You fall into the end zone, we're done. That's it. That's where we are.
Why is this his economic policy?
Because nothing else left for him. Let's start with tariffs, right? Tariffs is the number one weapon that he's deploying. Tariffs have been in existence for hundreds of years. The United States has used tariffs at various points in its history since it was independent and could do so. So right after the Revolutionary War, we had the power to do, and we have on occasion done tariffs. Okay, number one. Number two, some tariffs were worked out in deals with the rest of the world and have not occasioned a problem because we gave stuff that we could also benefit from. I'll give you an example. In the 1960s, there was a really serious struggle when the United States wanted to levy tariffs on foreign automobiles. Why? Because coming out of World War II, the rebuilding of the German and Japanese economies from World War II destruction led both countries to the same strategy. The best way we can recover from the war is to outdo the number one dominant economy in the world, the United States, and its number one industry at that time, automobiles. If we can't do that, they're going to dominate forever. That's our task, that's our goal, that's our measure of success. Can we produce a better car at a lower price? Enter Volkswagen. By the way, Hitler's project, Volkswagen. Volkswagen in German means the people's car. Toyota, you know them. You know the Japanese. We all know them now. They started to come in. There was the romance of the VW Beetle, the little round one. And the auto companies went crazy. Detroit, which was our auto center at that time, was the dominant success story of American capitalism. When foreign dignitaries came to Washington, the president would fly with them to Detroit to have them look at Dearborn or look at the Ford plant or the GM plant or the Chrysler plant. Look here look at this technology. Look at the workers, how satisfied they are. Look, we got a significant number of black workers here. See, we're overcoming our racial, it was half bullshit, but half genuine, justified. And there was a horror. Our dominance would be undone because the VW was a better car at a cheaper price. And the Japanese came shortly thereafter. And so a deal was struck. Here's the truck. We're going to put a tariff, but we won't put it on every car. And we'll put it low on regular cars. But you got to give us one thing. We're going to put a fat tariff. And in exchange, you can put a tariff on some of our agricultural products. The Europeans were interested in preserving their agriculture, particularly their chicken production, and Americans are good at making chicken. The chicken is no good, but the cheap price is spectacular. Anyway, long story short, a tariff was attached to the pickup truck, a big one, 25%. Compared to all the a sedan, 2.5%. That tariff has been in effect for half a century. You know why Americans celebrate the pickup truck? Why every he-man has a pickup truck? Because it's a symbol of masculinity? Not at all. You had to train the American buffoon to want that truck. You know why? Because the profit margin on the truck is way better than the profit margin on a car. And why? Because of the tariff. No foreign. That's why you don't see very many foreign. The pickup truck that has the name Toyota, that was made here to escape the tariff. You know, it's just, so there's nothing new about it. And therefore, there's a literature, many more books than you have on your shelf here about tariffs. It's been it's a segment of every course in international trade ever taught. And I've taught them. The library's full of enormous studies of every tariff there's ever been. Studies. Did it work? Did it fail? Why did it work? Why did it fail? And here's the conclusion. It'll save you a lot of time. I've done the literature. I've taught the course. We don't know is the answer. The effect of a tariff depends on the context within which it's said. It's a little bit like the phrase, oh shit. The impact of saying, oh shit, loudly in a group of people depends on that group, who they are, what they're used to. They'll either be horrified or they'll give it no notice, right? It depends on, that's what a tariff is. So when the president says, I'm going to do this, I'm going to tariff, it's going to have this result, you're talking to a moron. Somebody who is talking right out of the other end, because he has no idea what he's talking about. What will be the effect of the tariff on Canada? I don't know. And I know he doesn't know. Right? It could be, there's the Hail Mary. Could it get him the result he's hoping for? Yeah. When the quarterback heaves the Hail Mary pass, could it be end up caught by his tight end? Possible. Possible. Mr. Trump's policy, if he's luckier than I don't know who, could work out. But as a policy, with his, bravado explaining, it's so pathetically absurd that people like us, and you don't have to be a leftist to understand it. Any half-wit trained economist knows, this is first-year economic class in college stuff, right? He either didn't have it or he's forgotten it. You can't do this. And so I'm here to tell you that the consequences of the tariff could be a serious boost to inflation here. Because remember, a tariff means stuff coming into the country costs more, right? A bag of coffee coming in from Latin America or from Mexico, for example, costs $100, let's say. He's going to put a $25% tariff. You're going to have to pay $100 to get the bag of coffee, plus $25 to Uncle Sam. That's the tariff. It's a tax. Mr. Trump often says that the tariff is paid by the other country. This is wrong. It's not paid by the other country. It's paid by Americans. Nobody else is billed. The United States can't bill another country for a tax. It's not the way the system works. Nigeria cannot bill us for taxes their legislature passes. It's not the way it works. Okay, so now the coffee will cost to the American buyer $125. Let's say the American buyer is a company called Starbucks. They now have to pay 25% more for their single most important input. You know what's going to happen to the price of your latte? The inflation is going to get major worse. Multiply it by not just coffee, but by all the other items. Our biggest trading partners are Mexico and Canada, the two countries hit with 25% tariff. Those are the biggest sources of imports into the United States. So you could have here a sudden shock. The avocado toast that the nice people like to eat, that's going to cost a fortune. The avocados all come from Mexico. In the morning, you have coffee, which I just told you will go up in price, and into it you put sugar, which is an imported product, which will go up. Welcome to America of $20 for your morning coffee. You think the working class is angry now? Oh, wait. Mr. Trump won the election in part by the antipathy towards the Democrats held accountable for the inflation that we had during the Biden presidency. Mr. Trump really want to do that now, making himself to blame? Because everybody's going to say it's because of the tariffs, and it'll be largely true. And then we ask the question, what will the objects, the people hurt, and the Mexicans, and let me do Mexico because it's wonderful. It's so horrible, it's wonderful. We are deporting into Mexico more than any other country millions of undocumenteds that are being collected by ICE and sent over the border into Mexico. What's in Mexico for them? Nothing. There are no jobs in Mexico. Not for millions of people suddenly arriving. This is a catastrophe, but we're just beginning. Those millions who were working here in the United States, the millions of Mexicans all around us, they were taking a portion of their weekly salary and sending it back to Mexico for their grandma and their grandpa and their children that they left behind. This was, and I know the numbers, 18% of the GDP, if I'm not mistaken. A huge cash inflow to the Mexican economy. Gone. You return the workers for whom there's no work, and you cut off the source of income, and now you're saying, but you can't export anything to America anymore because we got a tariff against you, and a lot of people aren't going to buy $125 bag of coffee because they'll turn to tea. They're not going to. What is Mexico going to do? Where is Mexico? And in Canada, it's different. Canada sells us lumber. We're going to put a 25%. You know what? Nobody can afford to build houses in America now. Add 25% to the cost of lumber, kiss it goodbye. And rents will go. What? Half of this country uses electricity from Canada, the Midwest, brings Canadian electricity because Canada has oil, gas, and can generate masses of it. What is Canada going to do with its lumber, with its Oh, I know. There is a place that will buy all the electricity and all the lumber. It's called the People's Republic of China. Having a real competitor for the first time means everybody has options they never had before. So the real effect of Mr. Trump's policies and I haven't even gone through the impact on China or the impact on Europe, and he's throwing tariffs on them too. You could have a concatenation of events in which the unthought-through strategy of Mr. Trump doesn't yet take into account that there's another competitor who can buy if you don't, who can sell if you don't. You're not what you were. In the latter half of the 20th century, it all made a kind of sense. The United States says jump, and everybody asks how high. But we're not there. It's over. The empire is on its way down. You can live with that. You can make that decline manageable. You can avoid a trauma, or you cannot. For every example of an empire that went down traumatically, I can give you one that didn't, and vice versa. That's a choice we have if we take it seriously, which our leaders do not. So they're doing this, the retaliation. I mean, Canadians are en masse changing their summer vacation plans to not come to the United States. It's an interesting moment. Why? They're so shaken by all the rhetoric and everything. But that hurts our tourist industry, which is a significant industry in this country. 6 Canadians were planning normally to come to that resort or to be part of the sunbirds that come to Florida in the winter. But they're not coming anymore. And those people in Florida with their, you see, did you see what Mr. DeSantis did? This is another, he's the governor of Florida. He gave a speech 4 days ago in which he said, well, we got a problem here. We're deporting immigrants, but they're the ones who pick the fruits and vegetables upon which the Florida economy depends. But I have a solution. We're changing the law so children can go to work in the fields. That's the end of an empire. That's what happens. And no one says, boo. 14-year-olds will now be eligible to work until, I think, 9 at night. I mean, all kinds of things that the law forbade for children before. We're going to have child labor, and it's going to be good because, you see, you can pay the children as little as you got away with paying those immigrants. Jesus Christ. How many symptoms do you want to see before you go to the doctor? How many things are you going to face before you realize you got a different problem than the one you thought you had? And all of this, let me put it to you this way. If everything is going your way, you can afford to make mistakes, misjudgments, because everything is kind of going your way. So, yeah, you forgot to take care of that, but that's happening, and that's good, and that'll kind of compensate for the boo-boo you made, for the mistaken judge. And the problem is that's true. That is true. And the United States had that for the second half of the 20th century. But now the wind is going the other way. Everything's going down. There's no slack anymore. There's no space. Each mistake now worsens the other one. I'll give a very concrete example. When the United States decided to fight against the Russians about Ukraine, right? It was quickly understood, even before the war started, that Russia has, if not the greatest nuclear weapons in the world, second to the United States, and not a distant second, if it's at all second. Which means nuclear war is out. You couldn't possibly pick a worse choice than Russia to have a nuclear war with. I mean, pick China, pick anybody, Russia's got them. So there's not going to be a nuclear war. The two sides understand that would be crazy. Neither of them cares enough about Ukraine to run such a risk. Okay, what does that mean? Well, it means that if there's going to be a war, it's a conventional war. Army, Navy, Air Force in a war. Okay. But then you don't want to fight Russia, because Russia has a fantastic record in these kinds of wars. I mean, Napoleon tried and got defeated. And Kaiser Wilhelm tried and got defeated. And Adolf Hitler tried and got defeated. Do you really want to fight the Russians in an armed conventional war? The United States understood that. They really did. So they came up with the great way to victory: sanctions. Russia's a small economic unit. Russia's dependent on exporting oil and gas. We are the United States, and we have allies, the Europeans, and we're going to say to the Russians, we're going to sanction you. They did. This is the quote I'm quoting. I didn't make these things up. Mother of all sanctions. That's what they called it. We're hitting you with this, and then we're sanctioning oligarchs. We're sanctioning industries. We're sanctioning companies. We're sanctioning the whole country. We're sanctioning. And it was the biggest program of sanctions. There are thousands of sanctions right now on Russia. But the big one was Europe would stop buying. And to drive the point, the oil and gas, and to drive the point home, remember? They blew up the undersea cable, the undersea gas pipeline, right? I mean, extraordinary action to stop the Russians from exporting their number one moneymaker. That was going to bring them to their knees. The president said so. What wasn't calculated was that the Russians have a way to avoid the impact of the sanctions. Not the usual way, because sanctions are quite easy to evade. There's a book, I forget the author's name, but there's a book, a few years old, which is a study of sanctions. And the whole point of the book is to show you, done by some academic professor somewhere in the United States here, the whole point of the book is to show you that the sanctions never work. Country after country, he goes to, it's very good analysis. Anyway, it's not that. The mistake made by Biden and his people was not to understand the importance of China and its allies, known as the BRICS. You know, Belgium, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and the dozen other countries that are now part of that. What Russia did is say, okay, I don't have to sell it to you. I'm going to sell it to India and China. End of you lose. I got my money is coming in. Here's the joke. When you sell it to India, it just goes on another ship and goes right back to Europe. Russia is still selling its oil to Europe. It's just a
new middleman.
Yeah, but the beauty, they never understood because they didn't understand. They didn't understand that if you don't handle intellectually the change in the world, you're going to make catastrophic strategic mistakes. They lost the war in Ukraine. Russia now occupies a quarter of that country. They lost because the sanctions didn't work. And they didn't work because you didn't understand what this new configuration of the world economy is. So your sanctions aren't going to work. They're not going to work for 5 minutes. They don't even have to sneak around. They got these two monster countries. China and the BRICS is 55, I believe, percent of the world's people. The United States has 4.5% of the world's people. You can't overcome that. That's just light, that's light and day or whatever. It's just, you got to face this. You can't pretend you are not in the 1960s and 70s. You're just not. But we live in a country of, as my psychotherapist wife says, denial. And what we got is a country and a leadership that is committed deep down to denial. It's like watching the Europeans now. They couldn't defeat the Russians with the Americans backing them up. The Americans have now pulled out. And they're babbling to one another how they're going to do it. That's a joke. Not even a good one. That's a joke. That's so pathetic. It's painful. It's embarrassing to watch you talk. Keir Starmer, a relatively new prime minister in England, is wanting to send troops to Ukraine. You want to go down in history as the shortest prime minister ever? You do that, you idiot. What? What is it? Yeah, these are not stupid people. I don't mean idiot in that way. It's just, this is an idiotic. It's like the Hail Mary pass. We can do better than that. We are not, in the last 2 seconds, we are not. Don't do that. There's no need for this. But nobody asked that question. Everybody's enthralled with, going to hit them with a tariff, and I'm going to raise a tariff. And yesterday he did yet another unbelievably crazy thing. You know about TikTok. TikTok is Chinese, and Mr. Trump has said he won't tolerate them being Chinese, which is a topic in and of itself, but let's leave that. And the deadline for them to stop being Chinese is the 5th of April, which is coming up. But they haven't cut a deal yet. The Chinese, the hope was that American company would come in and get them for a cheap price because they're under the gun. They have to sell. Chinese are they're used to this. They're much smarter than that. So there's no deal yet, and there may not be one. And Mr. Trump begins to realize he's at the wrong end of this. Because if the Chinese are smart, they'll kill TikTok. And they'll say to the 20 million Americans who use it, you know who deprived you of your TikTok? The orange man. Someone told him yesterday or the day before, you're going to screw yourself here, Donald. They're going to go out. They'll reset it and call it Lick Lock 2 weeks later, and they'll have all the names. They have everything they need. They'll just move them, and the whole game will start all over again. Or they'll find an intermediary, some obscure Norwegian company, and make them the intermediary. All of this is being done, I'm sure. All taken care of. You're going to get screwed, Donald. So 4 days ago, Donald goes on the air and says the only thing he could say, I'm not going to impose the April 5th deadline. If a deal can be worked out, though, in the days and weeks following, I might take the tariffs off of China. Do you understand? What he's teaching everybody, even though it'll take him a long time to learn, is that this is all a game.
Real fast and loose.
Yeah. And I'm playing as fast and loose as I know how. I realize, oh, shit, this is going to come back and bite me. I got to do something. So what can I give the Chinese to back away from doing what they're about to do to me? Because more important for the Chinese than TikTok, no matter how many billions it's worth, is destroying the political base of Mr. Trump by depriving Americans of TikTok and blaming him for it, which they will be able to do. Wow. Now, he didn't think that through. Just like he didn't think through how sanctions could not work in the Ukraine situation. He didn't. The only other explanation, besides the chaos of all this, is if there's a method in the madness, if there's some strategic objective. And I have heard one. I don't buy it, but I might be wrong, and maybe it's true. I'll tell you that if you want. That he is, in fact, the prisoner of Mr. Putin. And that somehow making a mess here is the point. If it were the objective to do that, he's He's doing it.
You think that
No,
Putin could have something?
I don't believe that that's correct. I don't agree with that. But I've heard it. And look, it's like everything else. It's a symptom to hear it, whether it's true or not. And I don't think it is. I certainly don't know that it is. But that people are thinking that it's thoughtful. It's the intellectual effort to say, this is so bizarre and unusual that I need to think, why would this be? Don't get caught in the weeds. Why is the totality? An awful lot of Americans pick up the newspaper waiting each day for what Mr. Trump is going to say that's sort of outrageous or extreme or provocative. What is that? Could be his personal style. Yeah, okay. Even then, if you believe that, why are we having that now? We haven't had that for a long time, if ever. But what is this? So I'm sure people will come up with more and less far-fetched, because the situation is far-fetched. I don't blame people for coming up with these sorts of speculations, because it is provocative. You want to understand it. I want to understand. I wish I had an explanation. If you say to me, why is this whole thing happening? Well, I tell you my story of a declining empire. I think that does a good bit of putting these things together into a coherent argument. So I use it. Makes sense to me. I don't do the Putin story. That's American, demonization of your enemies and all of that. I mean, it's not that I like Mr. Putin. It has nothing to do with that. But I'm looking for explanations. When people offer one, I listen.
One of the amazing things, though, that comes out of these interviews is the tangents are often gems. And I can't resist one other one before we get back to the other stuff. And it's that, and I think it's actually could be relevant to the discussion at hand. And we've never spoken about Hitler on the show. And I think it would be interesting to hear, given the current environment maybe in the background, if there is a simple story, because obviously it's a complicated thing, but how it was that Hitler came to power in Germany.
Yeah, I'll be glad to give you a thumbnail overview of it. But let me start by telling you I think it is immediately applicable to the United States. And the way I tell you the story, I think you'll see how that works. If not, I'll make it explicit.
We can do both.
Yes. The German, think of it this way. In the 19th century, the dominant player in the global economy was Britain. It is the century of the British Empire, of whom it was said, the sun never sets on the British Empire, because wherever the sun is going down, there's Britain, and wherever it's coming up, there's another part of Britain, right? India was the great gem, but British Empire included parts of Latin America, large parts of Africa, large parts of Asia, and so forth. Not to speak of Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and all the rest of it. But there were two up-and-coming challengers to the British Empire across the 19th century. One was the United States, the ex-colony of Britain, and the other one was Germany. These two countries were capitalists, understood that Britain was the one to beat if you're going to make it. I don't think either of them aspired to replace the British Empire, but the thought crossed their mind, and it was a delicious thought. You have the United States, the Monroe Doctrine. We're going to take over Latin America is ours. Whoa, wow. Colonial dreams. Like taking Greenland, say, or Panama, or making Canada the 51st state, that sort of thing. And Germany had a notion of it really being a challenger to Britain. The German word Reich, das Reich in German, is empire in English, roughly. Hitler was going to create the Third Reich. That's what he called his project. They had had two earlier Reichs, the empire. The Germans had, for example, large chunks of Africa that they had colonized in the south, in the east, in the west. They had a piece of China. They had colonies in Asia and so forth. So they were trying to develop. In Germany, they were mostly successful, as they were in the United States. They not only grew dramatically, but Germany wasn't really a country until the second half of the 19th century. Before that, it was broken up into little principalities. So the United States had a bit of an edge because it was one country from Atlantic to Pacific, pretty much by the middle of the 19th century. The big thing that hampered the United States was the Civil War. The big thing that hampered the Germans was the unification, which is lots of little wars with France, with Denmark, and the different pulling together under a charismatic leader, Bismarck by name in Germany. But with the end of the Civil War, the 1860s, and by around roughly that time, a little later in Europe, you had these two powers had come together and were independent, had solved their divisions, north-south with the United States, the defeat of the South, and in the case of Germany, the defeat of those who opposed German unification, chief of which were the French. And they were defeated. In 1870, they were defeated. And I believe you and I have discussed it. The defeat by the Germans of the French opened a moment for the left to have an opportunity. That's the Paris Commune of 1871. Okay. In Germany, the experience here was spectacular. Instead of feeling to be way below the British were rich first. The British had the biggest empire. The British were the center of power. The world used the pound sterling as its currency, all of that. Germany always had an inferiority complex. So they went to work to develop quickly. So from 1860 to the end of the century, 1900, German economic development is spectacular, outgrowing the British Empire, despite the empire being still intact. But they were really, as the United States had its boost of development after 1860, building the railroads and everything else in the West. A whole middle class develops in Germany around the success of their capitalism. A working class, for sure, but a real bourgeoisie in the way remember, Germany is feudal much longer than Britain or France is. Feudalism stays strong in Eastern Europe relative to Western as it dies. Long story short, and here's the point. By 1914, Germany is a real successful powerhouse, an exploding economic success, people, middle-class people living extraordinarily prosperous lives. If you ever want to understand it, the novels of Thomas Mann, M-A-N-N, Buddenbrooks, and others capture that better than any sociology can. And the working class, which was the first working class to develop a real socialist movement on a mass scale, not so surprising, Marx was German, so they picked up on him. Very successful, powerful enough that Bismarck made deals with the social, had to. So you had an organized, confident working class who attributed their success not so much to the success of capitalism, but to the success of the Socialist Party in getting a piece of that activity for the working class. Very confident, very proud, and quite rich, saving money. For the Germans, very frugal. Very frugal. So they remembered the hard times before unity. It was clearer for them. And so they think the world is their oyster. They have an empire. It's productive for them. It brings them wealth, and then they have an absolutely crushing experience. All of this is under an emperor. In German, the word is Kaiser, like Tsar or something like that. Kaiser Wilhelm was the one in power at the time. And he leads them into World War I. They're going to win that battle like they've been winning everything else. They lose. World War I, horrific, the most devastating, destroying factories, railroads, everything, killing immense numbers of people in trench warfare, terribly destructive. But most important and cataclysmic for them, they lose. And now, very quickly, a 1, 2, 3 punch. After the war, the Versailles Treaty, which ends World War I, imposes reparations on Germany. The winners are going to make the loser pay for the war. And so Germany is required to devote a huge portion of its resources not to build up Germany after the terrible war, but to pay back the French and the British. And the French and the British insist on being paid. Why? Because to fight World War I, they had borrowed from the United States. That's why the United States becomes the world power, right there. It funded the World War that crushed its enemies or its potential competitors, and consequently the United States becomes the power because no war was fought here, no World War I.
No destruction.
No destruction. Relatively smaller number of people involved. World War II wasn't fought here either, except for Pearl Harbor. So you have it again. But before we get to that, here now comes the thing. So the Germans are, after World War I, utterly impoverished. If you want to get an idea of a society destroyed by this experience, then the thing you want to do is look at the painting, look at the literature, look at well, two names I'll give. George Gross, if you're at all familiar with the paintings of George Gross, that's painting Germany in the 1920s after the loss of World War I. The country's flooded with wounded soldiers.
Is this degenerate art?
Yeah. And the greatest theater producer probably in the whole century, Bertolt Brecht, writing in Berlin in the aftermath of this horrible, horrible war. Okay, they can't recover because they're funding the British and the French, who are using the money to repay the Americans. It's destroying what's left of Germany. The shock of the war, then the shock of losing the war, now the shock of being unable to recover. Where does it lead? It culminates the war is over in 1918. In 1923, 5 years later, Germany experiences the worst inflation in modern human history. In a matter of 8 months, the currency goes from 4 or 5 Deutschmark, that's the name of their currency, to $1, to 5 billion Deutschmark.
That's crazy.
My parents lived through that. My mother told me stories in which her parents, she lived in Berlin, her father would run home from his job at noon, grab a sandwich prepared by my grandmother, my mother's mother, because he would give her a little bag full of banknotes of money, and then run back to his job. She would run to the market to spend the money, because if she waited till the evening, the money wouldn't be worth anything anymore.
Yeah. And we think we've got it bad now. And it's bad now.
Well, now here comes the punchline. The Germans were frugal. For the previous 50 years of their spectacular growth and prosperity, they had saved up money. With the money saved by 2 generations over 50 years, they could now purchase a quarter pound of butter. They were wiped out. They couldn't handle it. 5 years later, in 1929, the stock market crashed and we entered the Great Depression. That means you hammered the German working class with a war, a loss of the war, the worst inflation ever, and the worst depression in capitalism's history, all in a 12 or 13-year period. It was too much, and they went crazy. And the proof of it is they turned to a non-German, non-blue-eyed blonde, non-tall person from Austria and said, "You will save us." Adolf Hitler. When does he take power? January of 1933. Right after he collects the catastrophe. In the last 2 elections of 1932, before he takes office, the country split right down the middle. Half went to the old German middle-of-the-road political parties, and the other half split between the Socialist Party and the Communist Party. And the business community held a meeting, of which there are records, which I used in my writing. What are we going to do? Both sides denounced capitalism on the grounds it had brought war. It had been responsible for the reparation. That's why Hitler had to call his fascist party socialist. It's the National Socialist Party. He had to tap into anti-capitalism, otherwise he wouldn't have got to first base. Nazi, N-A-Z-I, that's the first 4 letters of the German word National, which simply means national. It's the National Socialist Party. So it's Nazi Party against the socialists and communists. And those were fights in the streets. They were fights at the ballot box. The business community realized the country's dissolving into 2 wings. We have to make a choice. And they went with Hitler. And they turned to Hindenburg, the president of Germany at the time, and told him, "You have to invite Hitler to form a government." That's what they did. That's how it happened. Why is it similar? Now, here's the parallel. For the last 30 to 40 years in this country, there's been an income and wealth redistribution. Anybody who studies that, left-winger, right-winger, except for a few on the right, understand this. You can take a look at the Gini coefficient. You can take a look at all this status from the IRS and all the rest. We have moved wealth from the bottom and the middle in this country to the top. That's why even our candidates talk about the middle class is dying, the middle class is going. Yeah, that's right. The middle has fallen out, number one. Number two, you subjected them after this kind of a thing to a pandemic, which really shook them up, an inflation, which shook them up, still shakes them up, and a serious diminution in your position in the world. You have, over the last 30 to 40 years, you lost the war in Vietnam, you lost the war in Afghanistan, you lost the war in Iraq, and you are losing the war in Ukraine. too many things are happening. And the working class is hit in too many ways. It's upset, it's angry, it doesn't see a way out. That's a description of the German working class. That's why it went with Hitler. Enough, not all of it by a long shot, but enough of it to give him the chance to get rid of all of his enemies and reshape Germany. That ought to strike a chord. This morning's headline, this morning, 28th March 2025, the headline when I opened my news was that President Trump has appointed Vice President Vance to remove from the Smithsonian Institute the anti-American improper ideology. What the hell is that? What is that? You know what the first thing comes to my mind? In the 1950s here in America, we had something called the Un-American Activities Committee in the House of Representatives that hounded people out of their jobs and their positions because they held views that a collection of congressmen, many from the South, held to be un-American. Now, we've come to regret that. That's McCarthyism, and but that's what they did. By the way, among the people who left the United States because they were hounded by this committee for their ideas were Bertolt Brecht, Charlie Chaplin. I could go on. That's one of the reasons we came, I thought, to understand what an aberrant, horrible period this was. We understood nothing. We're just doing it again. Will the outcome be the same? I don't know. Maybe they'll win this time. Maybe we won't have what happened in the 50s. We'll have what happened in Germany in the 30s. But the story in Germany of a working class that was shocked. The American working class was told that America was the king of the hill, which coming out of World War II, we were. And that this was just, it was the way it was, American exceptionalism, the uniqueness, God loves us, whatever the form in which you celebrated it. But nobody here was prepared that it would come to an end. That for the first time in a century, we actually have an economic competitor called China. We never had that. Russia, I think I told you this before, Russia was never, Soviet Union was not an economic competitor. It was way too poor, way too small. Even today, the American GDP is $29 trillion. Russian GDP, $3 trillion. This is David and Goliath, but David minus the slingshot. You know what? They have military. They have nuclear weapon. I shouldn't say minus the slingshot. Here's a slingshot, but it's still David with a slingshot. China's 18 or 19 trillion. That's a serious competitor. The two together, now you're talking, and they understand it, and so do the folks here. But not the American people. They must be kept innocent of all of this, except when they leak their materials to the Atlantic magazine.
One particular possible symptom I'd be curious to hear about is Elon Musk and Doge, and how you see that fitting into the state of the American empire.
There's nothing new, original, extraordinary about all of that, with one exception. The choice of a person who is not given a top government job to do this, to have this sort of friend, I don't know how to describe what you would call him. I know it's called the Department of Government Efficiency, but I don't believe there is such a, they made that up. There was no existing, and I don't even think they've gone through some bureaucratic there is a way to add a person to the cabinet. You could have we haven't always had an EPA. We haven't always had a whole bunch of agencies. Over time, if something is needed, you could do that. You could have developed a Department of Government Efficiency long ago if you wanted that. But my understanding, it doesn't exist. It's just a made-up thing. So that is unusual that a person who's a friend is given such an important position. And then it's also unusual that friend is the largest contributor of money to a political operation, I believe, in American history. If I have understood correctly, it's somewhere around $300 million, one way or another, through one channel or another, that he contributed to Mr. Trump's effort this last time.
Oh, wow.
Huge amounts of money. And it's also a person who is contributing. I know right now that on Tuesday is an election in Wisconsin. They elect their Supreme Court judges. So there's an election for a Supreme Court judge. And if I understand the political, it's a 50-50 split on the Supreme Court, so that this election will kind of tilt the balance which way that court goes. And the left and right, Wisconsin is a state of importance because it's not either in one camp or the other. It's half-half. He is giving money, I believe $100, to every voter who signs a petition that he has, and he has circulating. Now, obviously, the idea is, if I can get this person to sign the petition for $100, I'm going to let them know I want their vote. You can't literally give people money for a vote. I believe that's a crime in most states. You can't do that. Of course, that's a crime because we used to do that in this country. And then there was an outrage and it stopped. So he's skirting that law to do this. A person who gives money to buy voters, whether it was in the presidential election or in Wisconsin, or in who knows how many other. I haven't done the work, and I'm not aware of anybody who's asked the question, to whom else has he given money? We do know that he went to Germany and spoke there before their last election about how the German people should vote for the extreme right-wing party. I don't know if you're familiar with that. The party is called the Alternative für Deutschland, AfD. It got about 20-something% of the vote, did very well in the last election. He visited Germany and said, this is the only party that can save Germany. An extraordinary act. In case your audience is not aware, there are 4 or 5 other parties in Germany. It's a multi-party society. All the other parties, all 5 of them, have vowed never to work with, never to have a coalition with that alternative, because they are thought of as the inheritors of the Nazi history. The leading advisor to the President of the United States officially goes and supports the extreme. You want to know why the Germans are upset with the United States? Before you get to the tariff on BMWs and Mercedes, which is coming, and that's terrible for the Germans. Their exports of cars to the United States are very important for the German economy, so you can bet they are scrambling now, really. But even before that, this kind of interference in their internal politics, holy mackerel. And I don't know if he gave money. I don't know if it's known, and I don't know how much it might be. But given what he's done everywhere else, I wouldn't be surprised. And since his wealth is listed, last I saw, at around $400 billion, giving 10, 20, or 100, or 200, or $300 million is immaterial to him. It's like you're giving me a quarter for my next political race. Thank you very much, but it's a quarter. That's unique, that a big, huge money donor becomes a kind of an adjunct to the president without being part of the administration the way others are. So, for example, he doesn't have to go before the Senate to be approved. They get to have him there. It might have been brought out by Senate research, which they're supposed to do, what he has done in his life, and that might have made it much more difficult for Mr. Trump to give him the power he has. He comes from South Africa. Ooh, that might be an issue. What did he do there, given the horrors of that society and its history? Anyway, all of that was avoided by this maneuver. Okay, that's interesting, that's unusual. Other than that, everything is the same. And let me go through a couple with you. Every employer that I've ever studied, or every employer that I've ever worked for, has on occasion fired people. Sometimes a few, sometimes a lot. And one of the standard behaviors of employers when they fire you is not to tell you the truth. And there are many reasons for that. It's not about honesty in the normal sense of it. It's because, I'll give you an example. If I were to tell if I were an employer and I needed to fire people and say the reason is my business is not doing so well, I can't sell as many widgets, and so I can't afford to hire people if I can't sell what they help me produce, I fire them. But if I tell them, look, and they ask me, at the moment I'm saying, don't come back Monday, they say to me, why? Is my work no good? I could say that, but that's hurtful and that's not true. Nothing to do with their work. It's because I can't sell the output. Nothing to do with you. I can't tell them that because that's going to make everyone I didn't fire frightened. And when they're frightened, you know what they're going to do? Look for another job. And if a good one comes along, they're not wait for me to fire them if they find a good job. Better to go where I know I can get a job than to wait for the axe to fall, right? So I don't want that. I don't want anxiety among my workers. I don't want to lose them before. It's when I have to, I want to be able to fire you. I don't want you to make that decision because that's a burden on me. So all employers, either themselves, if they have a brain, or they hire a consultant to give them the line of blah, blah, to tell a worker who's fired, and you choose carefully what to say so that other people aren't provoked into leaving. Number one. Number two, if you're a public-facing enterprise, in other words, you deal with the larger public, then you got to worry about how they hear the news, right? I don't want to buy from a loser. So you got to be careful. You got to probably pay you to do a little extra advertising to make yourself look good, so that music drowns out the firing. Long story short, one of the things you say is that you are only working to remove the inefficiency that dogs your business. And that as soon as these people are fired, the efficiency problem will be solved. Which means if you didn't lose your job, don't worry, whatever it is made us do it is done. You're the lucky one, you're saved, the other ones are. Now, for this to work, there has to be no countervailing evidence. But in Mr. Musk's case, partly because I don't think they're very good at what they do, they didn't take care of that. Here again is that element of flying by the seat of your pants, the element of chaos, the element of fast and loose. Let me give you some examples. The efficiency story is only, of course, about federal employees, because who's being fired are federal employees. Now, let's take a look at that together, right? I'm an economist. I'm supposed to know these things. So I did a little research, and here's what I found. There are about 2.5 million civilian employees of the federal government. Another 2.5 million are the military, but I'm going to put them aside. Civilian employees, the people who staff all the agencies, the IRS, the EPA, the AID, all those that we've been reading about, 2.5 million. I then went back to 1960s, and I said, what was the number of federal employees in the 1960s? Answer, about 2.5 million. Whoa, wait a minute then. In the 1960s, we had 2.5 million civilian employees, give or take. And in 2025, we had 2.5 million. The population of the United States has grown 150 million people between the 60s and now.
I am surprised to hear this.
Yeah. Which means under the normal way efficiency is used in economics, the same number of federal employees that serviced 150 million fewer people in the 1960s is now servicing them. That's an incredible increase in efficiency. You moron. What do you do? You can't justify this on grounds of efficiency. It's ridiculous. But it gets better. I then took the next step. How many people work for state governments, all 50 of them? 5 million civilian employees. And now the third level of government in the United States, the local, cities, towns, 15 million. So if you want to bring efficiency to government work, would you focus on the federal 2.5 million or the state and local 20 million? You focus on the federal because he can. He can't do it to the state people. They're employed by the governor and the state, and ditto for the local. So he's only going off after them because he can, not because it's efficient. It isn't efficient. First of all, they are efficient. And second of all, efficiency would require you to do something about state and local government about which they are doing exactly nothing. Not even trying. Partly because they would get a pushback, first of all, from every democratically governed city and state, which would mean the vast majority of cities are governed by Democrats, not by Republicans. It can't. And he would run political. That's all this is. It's a show. And look at the imagery. This is the best part for me. Because it's a level of incompetence that I gasp at. Unless I'm missing something, I made mistakes too. On the stage, covered by 1 million cameras, is a prancing Elon Musk gripping a chainsaw. I don't know if you caught that picture, all over the country. He was on, I don't know what the occasion was, but he's up on a platform, a speaker's platform, in his signature T-shirt and baseball cap, holding a chainsaw. And the point was, I'm taking a chainsaw to the waist in the federal workforce. So Americans saw the richest man on earth taking a chainsaw to rip the jobs away from tens of thousands of working people. I mean, I would, if a student portrayed such a story in a class on public relations, I'd say, I'm not just going to give you an F. I'm throwing you out of the class, because that level of misunderstanding of what this is about is beyond repair. I mean, that could occur to you and that you would do it without nobody or yourself introducing the question, maybe that's not the image you want. That image will haunt the Republicans. If I were a Democratic advisor, which I have been in my life, I would say, just take this. The billionaire is firing the workers. But what? Also, to fire 10,000 at a time, which he's doing in the IRS, he did that. In AID, he did that. That's not efficiency. If you're going to make efficiency, means you have to study the situation, look really carefully at what everybody is doing, and then figure out better ways of doing wholesale. No efficiency expert would tell you to do that. That's dumb. That's chaos. The mere chaos recovery will undo the efficiency you get. Now, let's suppose you get 10% more efficiency. You're going to get 10% loss from the upset of all the workers who are not, and then even crazier, they undo it. They didn't take the legal steps to enable them to do it. So it turns out they violated half a dozen laws. So the people who get fired go into court, get a lawyer, and that's now running through 57 different courts. And some of these judges are siding with the workers, which is likely going to happen. That's going to hold it all up, which means you've alienated that worker. You've made that worker look for another job. Meanwhile, you may have to give that worker his job back and his salary back and possibly pay a penalty. Who does things like that? What? This is for show. It's like having ICE pick up, a Turkish professor who teaches oceanography at Dipsy Doodle University and ship her out of here. What for? Well, it scares people. It is demonstrable. It is dramatic. It gets you on the news. Otherwise, we're back to where we were before. What is going on here? Well, when there's a catastrophe at your house and everybody's fleeing, you don't behave the normal way you do. You say things, you throw things, you grab hold of things in a way you wouldn't normally do. And we understand why, because you're a bit of a panic here and you're desperate to get out. That, for me, is another symptom of a declining empire. As important in its way as losing the war in Afghanistan or turning on your erstwhile enemies. If you learn how to swim, or if you're instructed in how to be a swimming lifeguard, you're told that one of the things you have to be careful about is that a person drowning or losing control in the water, if you go to help them, they will grab onto you and actually pull you down with them, not intending you harm, but they are desperate because their lungs are filling up with water. So you've got to approach them very carefully, or else it'll be two people drowning, not just the other person. That's the sense I want to convey here, that we are seeing people behave. Canada is an ally, has always been. Mexico, basically also. Subordinate allies. Why would you turn on them? Why would you insult them? Call the president of the prime minister of their country governor, as if he were the head of a state. Say such a thing. Why are you telling the people of Denmark, I'm going to take it. I want it. I'm going to take it. What would you do? What is that? That's the behavior of a drowning person who grabs hold of your swimming trunks because it's just trying to save him. You don't mean to pull off your pants. It's just the way it works. That's a little bit of what I'm thinking. And I can tell you that more and more of the world is looking at the United States now. And I've not seen this before in my lifetime here. Born in Ohio, lived and worked here all my life. The United States is a rogue country. The United States is the country to which the rest of the world looks, what the hell is going on there? You know how the United States tried to to portray the head of North Korea, a country nobody knows anything about, right? He's crazy. He's a little fat man, and he's bizarre. That's how the world is looking at Mr. Trump and the United States. In that moment, Donald Trump says, I'm going to take back the Panama Canal. I'm going to take Greenland away from Denmark. I'm going to take Canada away from the Canadian. What? Here's a wonderful Hegelian irony. Coming out of World War II, a thinker of that time who was very important, named George Kennan, I believe he's credited with the phrase that American foreign policy has now to be focused on, and that came the key word, containment. And the containment had to do with the Soviet Union. You had to contain this communism. Because after World War II, now there was that cordon of countries of Eastern Europe, the Warsaw Pact, Poland in the north to Bulgaria in the south, a buffer zone of sorts before you got to Russia proper. So it had spread because those were all communist things. And so we had to contain. That's why there's the ring of bases. If you ever look at American foreign military bases, they're literally a ring around Russia. Russia's the largest country by geography in the world. And so it's quite a ring you have to put. We were going to contain Russia. And the policy was to line everybody else into this containment. NATO was conceived as a mechanism of containment. It was the way the United States would link and mobilize Europe, or at least Western Europe, to contain Russia. The irony is the project to contain has become its opposite. It's we who are becoming isolated. We who are becoming contained. Not by a ring of bases, although that may come at this point, but by a ring of alliances and coalitions for which the United States is the enemy. Recent votes in the United Nations, if you take a look, it's more and more isolated. It's the United States, Israel, and the Tobago Islands. That's more or less how it goes. Right? We're alone. We're alone. Coalition of the willing. It's a joke. There was no coalition. On paper, yes. So it was 200,000 American troops in Southeast Asia and 11 French paratroopers, and 12 British. It's silly. But the silliness now is becoming almost perverse. The Europeans feel they've been turned on, and they are. The United States is alone. It's even turned on its neighbors. The heads of Mexico, Scheinbaum, and the head of Canada, the banker, Carney, or whatever his name is, they're making incredible statements. The world has changed. Our friendship is over. Our relationship. Okay, yes, it's just words at this point, but we've not seen those words, not in 75 years. Everything, words are not zero. It's not that they don't mean anything. They're very powerful institutions. If you ever study Freud and psychology, the words you use are very powerful shapers of you as well as everybody around you. So I would argue the United States is becoming more and more isolated. And I think that the Elon Musk phenomena makes it worse. This is an easy person to dislike, an easy person to feel alien from. And, look at what's happening to his automobiles. And he too admits it, he's paying now a spectacular price for what he's doing. There's a demonstration tomorrow in the headquarters of Tesla here in New York City. And I expect there'll be hundreds, if not thousands, of people there at the Tesla, against Mr. Musk as a representation of what's going on. And certainly people are not buying his cars. His dealerships announced that. The Chinese announced, I don't know if you're aware, 2 days ago, the Chinese announced that the best-selling electric cars in China are no longer Teslas. Their own company, BYD, which stands, if I'm correctly informed, BYD is the name of the corporation, stands for Build Your Dream. English. They are the world's biggest producer now of electric cars and trucks. And they're the biggest seller in China. They surpassed Tesla by a lot. First year that they did that. Tesla's not selling in Europe. It's a catastrophe for him in Europe. He's associated with Mr. Trump. And that's the worst advertising imaginable in the world right now. And that too is a symptom. The joke about the end of the Roman Empire is the Emperor Nero on a balcony playing the violin, which he was good at. But he's not troubled by Rome, it was said, is burning. He's fiddling. Not a bad image. Mr. Trump is fiddling. Rome is burning. You can't, after a while, get too hot. The strings will pop and your violin won't sound so good. It's a serious, I'm trying to have a little humor in it, but it is, in fact, a very serious situation. And there is not the admission, there's not the recognition. I will tell you that more and more people are asking me to talk because they don't agree with me, but they kind of feel as though they ought to hear it.
You're a symptom of the decline of the American empire.
Absolutely. I'd have to list myself among them. It's not so much me, although maybe that's true too. What I was about to say is interest in what I have to say is a symptom. It's not that I've been saying things that are all that different from what I said 10 years ago or 20 years ago. But now, the number of people, wow, I can't quite get over it. Doing a lot of work in India right now because of the interest. Podcasters and radio and TV. India's in a big country, bigger than China, by the way. It just changed a little bit. They just went ahead of them population by a little. But India is absolutely important country. Then I'm overwhelmed by how well what I say is known there, how many different outlets are approaching me. It's flattering. I don't deny it for a minute. But I think there's a sense of something very big shifting in the world, at all levels of society, different stories to account for it, different ways of interpreting it, understood. But it's still important that it's happening in different ways, but it's all happening at the same time, and that somehow the relationship between the United States and its leaders and everything else in the world is a key part of almost every story.
I'm taken by this image of the drowning child pulling down somebody's trunks.
Or shirt. I didn't mean to pick on the trunks.
Trunks makes it funnier, though.
Yeah.
But one of your theses, ideas, is that capitalism is dying and it's being replaced by something else, witness China. And I wonder then if you see Elon Musk and by extension the increased role of corporations or private wealth in government as symptomatic or emblematic or representative of this dying capitalism's last gasp at trying to double down. Do you see that at
Yes,
all?
I would put it a little bit differently. Let me use it. You notice I use history a lot. I studied history. It's what comes to my mind because of who I am. If you study the history of feudalism, the system dominant in the Western world before capitalism arrives, right? 1,000 years, 500 AD, roughly, collapse of Rome, Renaissance, 1500, 1600, arrival of capitalism, roughly. Then in those 1,000 years of feudalism, you see a remarkable evolution. Feudalism starts as a highly decentralized. It's the opposite of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was a concentrated empire with a headquarters in Rome, blah, 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 blah. Feudalism is dispersed, not hierarchical, lots of little lords and serfs who are their own little entities. You know, modern countries like France, Germany, Italy come much later. They had to be created. They weren't there before. Rome Empire falls apart. It breaks into many, many little pieces. Yet by the end of feudalism, by the 15th, 16th century, what you have are something called absolute monarchies. The opposite of early feudalism, highly concentrated, state-dominated feudal societies. They even had to take one of the feudal lords, who used to be many, and make them get, like competition. They fought each other, they absorbed each other, and eventually one becomes the number one feudal lord who takes the name king. That's what kings are. The biggest, bestest feudal lord. You know, the absolute monarchies, they're the ones that created the Versailles Gardens. If you ever visited Paris, you go to the tourist thing outside of the city in Versailles, spectacular palaces, gardens. These were very rich, highly organized, they produced the great painters, the great chateaus that you visit to this day. Why am I telling you this? I'll quote Marx. Marx wrote, "No system disappears before all the possible forms of it have been tried and utilized as far as they could be. Then we get the next system." Feudalism went through a decentralized, through several steps, to a highly centralized. It went from a purely agricultural to lots of cities in medieval Europe. It handled urbanization. It went from no trade, everything self-sufficient, to lots of trade, right? Capitalism, likewise. It goes from the small capitalist with a dozen workers to the big modern corporation, from a local corporation to a national corporation, to a multinational corporation, to a global corporation. Why am I telling you this? Here's another way capitalism evolved. It started as a thoroughly private enterprise undertaking. Coming out of feudalism, there were a few of these people who set up little businesses, but they had no relationship to the government. That was all feudalism. That was the king. He didn't care about them. They were the opposite. If anything, he went and taxed them. They didn't like it, and so they fought back. and they got little privileges of not being taxed, of not being regulated, little walled towns where they could be free. Why am I telling you this? Because over time, as they grew, they stopped being angry about the state and realized, maybe we'd be better off trying to control this state. Don't get rid of it. Control it so it works for us, not for the feudals, which is where the state comes from, and not for the working class. We don't want that. But for us, we want the government for the employer. And so they needed to develop the government to give it the capacity to do that. On the one hand, for example, the capacity that if the workers revolt, remember, workers are many, employers are few. U.S. Census right now classifies 3% of the American people as employers. The other 97% are not. Okay, that's a problem for employers because they're a small minority. They need to control the government to make sure the majority doesn't crush them. So now they need a strong government with troops and police and army and a judicial system. So the worker who wants to rebel gets punished and stuck in a jail or fined. Then they need also help because other capitalists in other countries eye them with jealousy. So we need a navy and we need slowly the government has to be built up. You don't trust it, you don't like it, but you have to do it. In that scenario, what China is not what you said. China is a recognition, as we talked a little bit before, that capitalism needs to go through all the phases it can to survive. It adjusted the private quality of its beginnings by allowing the state to take a bigger and bigger role. It didn't do it in a straight line. The great crash of 1929 brought the government in massively to save capitalism. But in the aftermath of World War II, they pushed the government back out. That's what you and I have lived our lives in a period when they pushed the government out. In a way, Mr. Trump is the end of that period. When we push he'd bring the government back in. But here's the crucial thing for China. We've had the government minimal, early capitalism. We've had the government brought in, Keynes, the Depression, and then this thing called Scandinavian socialism, which seemed to mean a regulatory government, a taxing government, lots of social services produced by the government, but basically private capitalism for the bulk of the goods and services in the society. So that's another form. Then we had the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union called itself socialist, like the Scandinavians do, but they meant something very different. They meant the government takes over and runs the enterprise. And they said that was socialism. But I would argue, as you've heard me, I think, before, that it isn't. It wasn't socialism. I don't dispute. You can call it whatever you want. But they never changed the employer-employee structure of enterprises. Small group of people, the owner, the director, the board of directors, whatever you want to call it, overseeing and ordering about a mass of workers who are employees. They have very little power. They have all the power. These people fire those, not the other way around. These people direct those, not the other way around. These people produce a surplus that they get, not the other way around. In other words, this is a highly structured arrangement. For me, that's capitalism. And that was there when capitalism was small and had a few workers, and it's there with a major corporation today. It's there whether the private people do it or whether the government does it. So for me, we're still working out all the ways you can have capitalism if you understand it as the employer-employee relationship in production. Then China is simply the latest experiment in yet another form. It's not private capitalism, where you might take the example Britain and the United States. It's not the Soviet Union, no private capitalism, all government does everything. The in-between, Scandinavian, with a little government and mostly private. And now the Chinese, 50-50, with a super powerful state and Communist Party on top. That's a wrinkle. But that wrinkle has been more productive in a shorter amount of time than any of the others. Just like the absolute monarchies were the most effective, spectacular achievements of feudalism. So I'm not surprised. I think the reason China is ahead is it figured out that form of capitalism which could get it out of poverty, which was its number one goal. 100 years of humiliation of China, was it because it was poor, backward technologically, underdeveloped, like the whole global South, like all of Africa, like most of Asia, like most of Latin America. The name of the game for them was, above all else, not the struggle of capitalism and socialism. The leaders were worried about that. For the mass of people, how to get out of my poverty, all that meant, and begin to live life. The Chinese Communist Party understood that, in part because of their differences with the Soviet Union stuff that we talked about. And they understood that's the way we're going to try to do it. With all the risks, all the possibilities of failure, we're going to do a hybrid of 50. We're going to let the private go under our control. Meanwhile, keep our control by having half the economy right under our That's how we're going to do it. And at this moment, the year 2025, there is no contest anymore. Look at it this way. Europe had 500 years to get ready to compete with the United States. They failed. All the hot technology in the world today comes from the United States or China. Europe, nothing. Look, there's no comparable Apple or Microsoft or BYD. BYD, the electric Chinese, they're on the roads of Europe because they don't have a 100% tariff. We do. So
100%.
100%. Mr. Trump put it up to 27.5%, and Mr. Biden raised it to 100%. So if you want to buy a BYD electric car, best in the world, cheapest in the world, $30,000, get a car. But that's what it'll cost. They'll ship you a car from China. They ship all over the world. I mean, all of that's taken care of. They're a very, very big and powerful company. By the way, there's an American who has a big piece of it, owns a big piece of BYD. His name is Warren Buffett.
Smart, canny guy.
Yeah. Not held back by stupid leftover Cold War nonsense. Never was. Anyway, BYD can't bring a car here because the $30,000 car, which I would buy tomorrow if I could, I have to give 100% tax to Uncle Sam. Another 30. So for me, the car costs $60,000, not 30. And that's why I don't buy any, because I can buy a $40,000 or $50,000 electric car from GM or Ford or Tesla or somebody else. It's not as good, but I don't have it. There's no tariff. Anyway, these situations mean that Mr. Musk and the United States are more and more looked at as a problem to contain, a little bit like Soviet communism looked to Americans. And the Chinese, in my judgment, are on the cusp, as we are in the United States, although for completely different reasons, given our very different situations. We're on the cusp of discovering what European feudalism discovered, that the highest achievement, capitalism in China as this hybrid, is also the last achievement. Now the Louis in France, who built Versailles, were the same family of Louis who ended up on the guillotine with their heads chopped off. I'm, of course, not suggesting anything remotely like that could or would ever happen here. Pause for effect. But the point is, now comes the question, what do we need to do better than what the Chinese have done? What's the next stage? How will people define the problems that the Chinese have and will have? Even the Chinese, they're very wise about that. They understand their system has problems, different from what they used to have. Thank God, they're much better off than they used to be, but they have all kinds of economic and other problems. Here's my prediction. These problems will, sooner or later, and I hope it's sooner, be addressed by daring to relearn Marx's lesson. Take a look at how you organize production. The notion that you have to have a few people at the top who run the show and a mass of people underneath who do the work is your problem. You've got to get rid of that. It's a little bit like understanding that for the centuries that there was slavery, there were all kinds of people who understood those slave systems had a problem. And there were all kinds of people who understood, let's solve the problem this way. Give the slave a better diet. Give the slave some more clothing. Put the slave in a decent house. Stop beating the slave. Don't sell the wife against the husband. Blah, blah, blah. And then there were people who said, no, you ain't going to solve your problem that way. You know what your problem is? The master-slave relationship. That's got to go. That's me. I'm just doing that now. It's that relationship that has to go. It's done. That was Marx's point. Poor fellow. Back in the 19th century, 150 years ago, he tried to get that across. Marx made mistakes. Marx is no saint and none of that. But he was very smart. And he set himself the problem, how do you do better than capitalism? And he spent a lifetime trying to figure it out. And he ended up with this conclusion, in my judgment. And I'm open to interpretations. Very Hegelian. The problem of capitalism is itself. It's not this or that. It's not get the workers a bigger wage. Stop. It's like getting the slave a better diet. Stop. Of course, we are in favor of a better diet for the slave. We're decent people. But that's not the problem. The problem is slavery. And the problem is capitalism. The problem, you have a tiny group of people who make all the decisions. Guess what? They're going to take the money and be the wealthy people, the top 10%, aren't they? Everywhere, all the time. And every few years we'll have a war on the poverty, which we seem unable to overcome. Now, why might that be? Look at the taboo in our culture right up to this minute. You can look at almost anything, but not that economic system. We will criticize our education system. We will criticize our transportation system. We even criticize institutions like marriage, like heterosexuality. But criticize the employer-employee doesn't occur to anyone. Well, 20 years ago, it didn't occur to anyone to question sexism or in many parts of the country, racism. There comes a time when in history it becomes possible to say, hey, this is outrageous, we won't tolerate this. That's going to come for capitalism. And my guess is it's a crapshoot. Whether it comes in the dying capitalism of the West or the rising capitalism of the East. My guess it's going to happen in both of them. And wherever it happens first, it'll be infectious on the other. Because the idea will be the problems we face now are finally those which will allow us to ask the question, might the solution to these problems be changing the organization of the workplace from a hierarchical top-down to, dare I say, a democratic arrangement in which all the people at the workplace get together, talk it out, and then have a vote. One person, one vote. After we've looked at all the technical and other aspects, after we've asked the opinions of those who have the technical information we need to make an informed decision. I remind people, all the key decisions in major corporations are made by a board of directors, most of whom have no technical expertise whatsoever. They bring in the specialists who explain to them, as is needed to make the decision, what the technical ramifications. When I explain how a democratic workplace is to be there, well, the sweeper can make a decision like the heart surgeon in a hospital. Sure he can. Those decisions that are technically complicated, the heart surgeons have to explain what they know. And the sweeper tells them about keeping the hallways clean. You tell what, and then when everybody's had a chance to explain, then you make a decision. That's all any board of directors ever did. That's what the workers democratically will do. And don't tell me it's not workable, because the same argument was used. How can uninformed voters make a decision? We need a king. We cut the king's head off. And the decisions are not arguably any worse, and in many ways better. So let's do that. Let's finally bring democracy to the workplace. It's long overdue. That's the next stage. That's what the revolution is about. Whether we'll see it this year, next year, who knows? But nobody should say of folks like us that we only have a criticism. No, we do have a criticism. Nowadays, it's less and less necessary to justify having a criticism, since everybody is feeling the need that there be some criticism because of what's going on. But we are often charged with not having an alternative. Yes, we do, and a good one, and one that comes right out of the problems today. I don't think we solve the poverty problem without the kind of change I've talked about. And my proof, look at it. We're surrounded by poverty. We have been working, we've had wars on poverty repeatedly, every 20 years. This problem doesn't go away. In Volume 1 of Capital, Marx writes that the capitalist system has to be understood as being as successful in reproducing poverty as it is in reproducing wealth. That's right. And boy, is that a Hegelian moment.
Given that you and I in a couple of days are about to be participating in this forum about China and the United States, I think it's worth asking right now just about how you see Mao ranking among the Marxists and what his contributions were and legacy is.
Oh, that's a hard one. Well, he's certainly among the important people. More, I don't mean to be unfair to him, but more because of his role. He brings sophisticated Marxism to China. I mean, you don't have to say anything else. That makes you a world historical figure of the greatest. I mean, it's stupefyingly important what he did. Number one. Number two, his political decision has shaped the world in a way not like Gramsci. Gramsci's got this corpus of work on analyzing culture. Mao didn't do anything like that, not that I'm aware of. But Mao said to the Marxian tradition, of which he had become a part, that your focus on the factory, on industry, as the crucial place to organize is a mistake. It took unbelievable courage. I said, and now, as if I were Mao, it is a mistake not to understand that the rural, agricultural peasant of the world can be an equivalently revolutionary force. In Western Europe, where Marxism is born, the most reactionary part of the society were the rural, uneducated, often illiterate, religiously dragged down. And so the chances to organize revolution there were hopeless. And revolutionaries who were themselves typically urban, relatively educated, relatively, they went to work on the workers that were close to them, that they understood, from which they themselves came, the urban, industrial, and you had this split. Mao is absolutely staggeringly important because he brings the notion of Marxism and Marxist revolutionary anti-capitalist mentality to rural areas who didn't have any capital. For them, they were just beginning to deal with capitalism, and they already had this enormous push against it, which makes the evolution of places like India and China radically different from the West, where the split of agriculture and industry. I mean, Mr. Trump's base is rural, is suburban, is not, the big cities of this country are where Mr. Trump has got a lot of problems, right? That's our culture. That's not the way it is in the East. And Mao is as much responsible for that as anybody, probably more so. So that innovation opened up Marxism to become revolutionary for what is the majority of the working class of this world, which is rural, was rural, still is rural and agricultural. And so now, India has 4 communist parties. China is ruled by a communist party. Vietnam is ruled. That Mao breaks all that open and makes that a force in the world. And if I had time, I would make you the argument that what that achieved is the foundation for the Chinese economic development post-World War II. And that means that Mao is responsible in a major way for the ability of China to be a superpower challenging the United States right now. If you deal with Mao in this country, they have no idea who you're talking. I mean, the lack of an understanding of just a simple story I just told you in this country is stupefying. It's like, I don't know how to make an equivalent. It's like if that fellow over there who's working with us wanted to light a cigarette, but didn't know how to do it. And I said, here's a lighter. He would be stunned. Look at that, a thing with the fire. Whoa. And you'd feel for him. Oh, my God, you're out of touch. We've had these lighters over 50 years. No, Mao is a bad person in China. End of conversation. And I'm talking about educated people like those at Harvard and Yale.
My Chinese teacher who's in China told me that they all really look up to him.
Yeah, for God's sake. Yes. Doesn't mean you can't disagree with this or that or this policy or his capacity of swimming up the Yangtze River and all the other funny stuff about him. He had that. They all do. But if the man is to Jesus Christ, what he accomplished. I would say this to you, that the pamphlets he wrote, you know, the history, the Long March, when they're driven out of the South, driven out of Shanghai. The early days of the Chinese Communist Party were in the cities, as was Marxism focused. And Mao was a young, middle-level income family kid. And he's organizing in Shanghai, in the south of China, in the urban, with a focus on the industrial. And the government of China at the time, a nationalist government, under the heading of a man who became famous later, Chiang Kai-shek, the leader, hates the communists. He is the expression of the emerging Chinese capitalist class, the entrepreneurs. Remember, China in the early 20th century is what we're talking about. This is 1920, in around there, 25. It's just coming out from being a semi-colony. It was never a colony in the sense that Britain owned China the way Britain owned India. That never happened. But along the coast of China, the cities that were interesting ports were snatched by European countries. So you can think of it as China had portions of itself taken over. Hong Kong by the British. There were Portuguese, there were Spanish, there were French. It was horrible. And the Europeans got together and defeated the old Chinese government in something called the Boxer Rebellion, right at the beginning of the 20th century. So China was, as they now say, going through its 100 years of humiliation. That's how it's called in China. And here were some communists who were upset about it. They probably, I don't remember the detail, but certainly from a good number of them, they had left China to become students in Western Europe. They didn't come to the United States in those days. If you were a young, aspiring, middle-classy kid in China in the 20s, you went to Germany, France, probably maybe England. I don't know. I know the ones about Germany because one of them became a student in Berlin and took my mother out on dates.
Oh.
Those I know. And I asked her to marry him, which she did not do, but she thought about it. She married my father, who's not that guy.
For which we are all thankful.
Yes, I hope so. Years later, my mother went to China to visit and let it be known to somebody. She didn't even remember who. Well, she had to get a visa and crap like that. That she knew Wan Pinyan, which was his name. He had by that time become a very high official in Mao's government. When the plane arrives, a black limousine, a mile long, comes out onto the runway. And as she comes down the stairs, they move her to the side. The rest of the passengers go in. She goes into the limousine, and there he is, welcoming her to China. A big moment. That's why I know all this. Chiang Kai-shek murders a whole bunch of them, sends the troops. They're having a meeting of their little, very small communist party at that time. in Shanghai. I'm pretty sure it's Shanghai, and murders a lot of them. But a bunch of them escape. And they then go on a long trek, pursued by Chiang Kai-shek's military, to escape. And they go deep into the interior. And that is called the Long March. If you read any history of China, there will be a chapter in the book on the Long March, because it was in that period. It took a long time. I mean, I don't know, maybe years. I mean, the Yunnan into the deep interior of China. You know, it's like, I don't know, if Americans had gone at some early point in the 19th century to the wilderness of northern Minnesota or something like that, you know, just far away. And they settled among peasants in this province. And they organized the peasants against their own landlords, built a base, and that saved them from the army of Chiang Kai-shek. And there they built an alternative system, society, putting many of their principles into effect, but also, not being stupid, built an army. It's very famous in China. It's called the I don't know the reason why, but it had the funny name, Eighth Route, 8 as in the number, Eighth Route Army. The people, the Red Army, the Eighth Army. Then the Japanese invade China, 1931. Then there's a war between China and Japan, and Chiang Kai-shek now has to stop pursuing the communists because he can't. I mean, they're too strong now in this distant province. Fights the war with the Japanese in alliance with Mao, who's now the leader in this Yunnan. And as soon as the war is over, the Japanese are defeated. They turn on each other, and they have the Chinese Civil War, which goes from 45 to 49. Mao wins, Chiang Kai-shek loses, leaves China for the island of Taiwan with his people, which is why Taiwan is
Really
weird. Yeah, that's how that happened.
That's the root of that.
That's all that's about. And if you want to know why the Chinese would be angry, they won a civil war. They worked together to defeat the Japanese, which they did. Chiang Kai-shek, the discredited, defeated loser of the Civil War, goes to this little island. It's like Jefferson Davis had gone to, I don't know, Staten Island and set up shop. The Chinese think that's their territory, which it is. And that it's their issue to work out, that the United States would decide that this is, you know, that is sheer cuckoo. And you couldn't possibly tell that story to the American people because it would have the effect it's having on you, which is, oh, I didn't realize this.
The things you learn when you're an ignorant guy like me talking to Rick Wolff.
It's
you
not
learn
your fault.
Etymology, world history.
Yeah, it's not your fault.
Thank you. I'd love to hear that.
No, it isn't. It isn't. It isn't. Look, I went to Harvard, Stanford, and Yale. The education I got was very mediocre. Really not terrible, but not very good. It's just, I had to learn to shit on my own. I had to. Where else would I?
Not Harvard, Yale, or Stanford, I guess.
No. What was at Harvard and Yale were other young people to work with me on it, but I think I would have found them anywhere, you know, at Caltech or at, I don't know, Illinois. What difference? There's always a few teachers. There's always a bunch of students. You find your way to them, you know, by accident. Oh, you're interested. You're having a beer with somebody. Turns out they are interesting people and all that. That's all that happened to me. But, I mean, I had the pressure of my politics. I knew it's got to be better than this. This, you know, as you grow up and you become an adult, this is it? You know, no, you can do better than this. And that impulse made me learn this stuff. I used to get angry. I do remember sitting in a lecture hall at Harvard. I remember it particularly, being so angry at the bullshit that was coming out of that teacher's mouth, that I would literally, I was a good student. I'm a good boy. I sat through it all, took my notes, and then I ran to the library afterwards to refute it, because I didn't know enough to do it, but I knew where I would have to go. And I would sit in the library sometimes for hours, scouring an article or a book to find out some way to express my anger and upset at what this person had told me, including courses on Chinese and Indian history, which I took because I wanted to learn about other societies. So, my parents were immigrants, so, but they were Europeans, so that kind of. But, the world had fallen apart on them. So that's why they had to be refugees. It's a traumatic experience to be a migrant. Again, we are busy deporting them, and so they have to be evil, empty vessels that nobody understands. But to be a migrant is a trauma. My mother was traumatized. My father was traumatized. They left their country, left their language, left their community, left their family, entered the United States, didn't speak English. What a mess. All the normal turmoils and troubles of life are multiplied by the additional strains and pressure. It's very hard, and my father worked himself literally to death, died relatively early of a heart attack, because he worked too hard. Had a wife, 2 children, my sister and me, hard to earn a living. He was a lawyer and a judge in Germany, my father. When I was born, he was pushing a wheelbarrow in Youngstown, Ohio, in a steel factory. So people have to understand that family that comes from Honduras, they were, raising bananas on a farm. Now they're working in Pittsburgh in a meat factory. You try to understand what these folks are going. No, deport them. So you grow up with. You also grow up with a concept. You're making me think. With a concept of difference. It's very hard for Americans. I spoke German at home mostly, and some French. Only when I was 5 years old, they dropped me into kindergarten. I learned English. I was born in Ohio, but I didn't speak English because, I'm a baby. I'm at home. Speak my mother and father language. My mother was German. She was the most important adult for me to deal with. So I spoke, I still speak German absolutely fluently because I did it the first 5 years. My French with my father I can do it. I can understand everything and I can make myself understood, but it's not fluent. It's labored. But here's what you get. Everything can be different. The English language is one thing, and the French and German are each of them separate from the other and separate from English. You understand everything could be different. It's hard to explain because you literally, if you're 11 years old, running around the playground with your friends talking English, except when you have to pee or you're thirsty, you run into your house and chit-chat with your mother in German, then you go back out. That trains you into the multiplicity of meanings, of intonations, of speech, and you appreciate difference. You're not frightened by it. You're not amazed by it. You assume it. And therefore, whenever anything happens, you naturally do what Hegel teaches you. The opposite. It's right in there. It's right there. It's not distant. It's not foreign. It's not it's right there. It's right there. It's right there. Anyway.
I think since China seems to be the clear rival to the American hegemony we'll be discussing, it is worth revisiting this idea you mentioned but didn't follow up on, which is that Mao is in many ways responsible for the economic powerhouse that China has become. And what I was going to say is that as a verified non-expert in Chinese economics, My understanding is that China today represents this strange blend of capitalist, but also people and state-owned, state-intervening economics. So I'm wondering how that comes out of Mao, if I'm roughly correct in my assessment.
Well, it's a very long discussion, so I'm going to give you a very short answer.
Please.
All right. Mao's only friend in that long march, when he's making that long march, at that point, the revolution has already happened in Russia, 1917. Lenin has died in 1923. So what's going on in Russia in the second half of the 20s is a struggle between the two most important leaders of the communist movement in Russia after Lenin, because they're inheriting the situation. One is named Stalin, and the other one is named Trotsky. And depending on how you come down on these things, one is a hero, the other one is an evil shithead, or vice versa. That's how that goes. The global communist movement splits on this subject. One side becomes the Trotskyist movement. The other is Stalinist movement. Stalin wins, Trotsky loses. First, he's kicked out of the government, Trotsky. Then he's kicked out of the Communist Party. Then he's kicked out of Russia. He actually comes here to New York, spends a little time on the Lower East Side, moves to Mexico. And in Stalin, while he's in Mexico, he becomes very important to the Mexican communist movement, which was very strong then, but especially among artists. And they hosted him. Those artists included Frida Kahlo. You know who she is? See, again, Americans know all about Frida Kahlo, but that she was the hostess of Trotsky and probably slept with him more than a few times is a carefully cleansed to avoid any notion that, it's just, there are three great muralists, one of the greatest Mexico-produced muralist painters. People, paint the wall, a muralist. Diego Rivera, the husband of Frida Kahlo. David Siqueiros and Ortega. If you go to the New School University, just a few blocks from here, there are murals up in the top of the building painted by Ortega. All over the Northeast here are painted by Diego Rivera, the Mexican. Rockefeller was one of his patrons. These are all communists. Siqueiros, Ortega, Diego, Kahlo, all communists, all Trotskyite friends of that. Stalin sent someone who killed him with an ice pick in his head.
Ice pick. I do remember that.
Very famous. So he's gone. Stalin takes over Russia, but Stalin and Russia help Mao. He's a communist. He's in China. It's a long shot. It's a few of them hunted by the government army, but they got support. So they were very loyal to the Soviet communists, who kept helping them and helped them all through the Civil War. And one of the reasons Mao won the Civil War is he had some support from Russia, from communist Russia at that time. I don't want to take away. It was Mao's victory. He organized that army. There was a big army of Chinese people. They fought and they won. So in the early years, from 1949 to the end of the 50s, first 10 years, China is a very loyal ally of the Soviet Union, and these are the years of the Cold War. So the United States, allies already earlier with Chiang Kai-shek, tries to smash them. So the Mao and his people are very clear. The United States is not our friend. They tried to kill us, for Chiang Kai-shek. Now Chiang Kai-shek is sitting in Taiwan, twiddling his thumbs. And now the Soviet Union is our ally, but that makes us the enemy of the United States, blah, 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 and all of that. If you ever go back and you look at American history at that time, there was a tremendous hullabaloo about who lost China. And McCarthy, remember the McCarthy of the Senate, McCarthy? They went after a high-ranking State Department official named Harry Dexter White, one of the highest officials, would have become Secretary of State at one point. He was in line like that. But they hounded him out because they found him to have been, as a young man, he went to a Communist Party event or something. They had him. And so he sold out the United States, and that's why we lost China. The idea that the Chinese had something to do with this, Americans can't have it. It's all about us. Anyway, so Harry Dexter White was blown out of the water, and the Chinese became officially bad. However, by that time, the revolution, being grounded in agriculture, had undertaken a number of experiments unlike anything the Soviets had done. Mao felt it was necessary. One of them, toward the end of the 1950s, was the commune movement in China. And under Mao's inspiration, they formed commune. I mean, the word communism doesn't suggest something that you would set up communes in which people's relationship with one another is communal, not hierarchical. That's a long story of how they worked for several years. My master's thesis at Stanford is an analysis of the commune movement in China. That's what I did. Because I wanted to learn about it. This gave me the opportunity to learn. I wrote a senior thesis. At Harvard, if you got very good grades, you could sign up for either magna cum laude or summa cum laude. And if you signed up for either or both of them, you were relieved of taking courses in the last semester of your senior year, and instead you would write a paper, a major, and I did that. And there I studied the rise of Hitler. That was that's my family. So I wanted to understand how did it come down on my mother and father to shake up their lives. By the time I was at Stanford, which was just a year later, I was on to studying China. And long story short, what Mao's experiments did was to freak the Russians out. And there began a tremendous, the German word, Spaltung, which comes from Freud. Splitting took place. For some years, China and Russia denounced each other. They even had military skirmishes on the Chinese-Russian border, shooting at each other. It then died down, but it was a split that meant that the global communist movement also split. There were those who went with the Soviet Union, and there were those who split off and became known as Maoists. That didn't exist before. In the great revolutionary upsurges of 1968 in France, when Charles de Gaulle was driven out of, I don't know if you know, the students arose in France, reached out and said to the working class, join us in a revolution. In those days, the French Communist Party picked up 20% of the vote in every election. Very, very powerful. And the students went to the communist workers and the Trotskyite workers who were also, and are still in France, important. And there was an alliance. And between the workers and the students, the chief of police of Paris went on the television and said to the government, if you come down on the students and workers, I can't be on your side, and neither will the police. De Gaulle got in an airplane, left France, went to an American airbase in Germany to wait. I mean, that's how close it came. Though the leaders of that were not the conventional Communist Party, which was afraid of doing that, but the Maoists went. The Maoists took over. And because they did, Mao came into the consciousness of the French people, brought by this revolutionary thing. Well, who was impressed? Louis Althusser, my teacher. Jean-Paul Sartre, never the same after that. Foucault, never the same after that. I could go on. Jacques Lacan, all of them. Many of them were Maoists, young students caught up in it. And they then read Mao, and they thought it. Charles Bettelheim, I don't know if these names mean anything to you, the leading intellectuals all around the country. They then began to study Mao and to study what he had done. And they began to go to China to offer advice, to give them the benefit of what the West had taught Marxists. So this was invaluable. This was a way for a third world country to tap Western technology and thought in a way that could never happen any other way. But nobody understood that. They don't get it now either. But it transformed not just the consciousness of the West learning about Mao, but the Maoists learning what the West had to teach them about strategy. Long story short, they made a strategic decision, which I don't think could have been done without Mao. Even though this was done, Mao is dead or dying, so it comes with his end. And the strategic decision is, we're going to build a socialism different from the one in the Soviet Union. That comes out of their split with Russia. And we're going to make it different from what socialism has meant in the West. What did it mean in the West? Well, to this day, right, there are socialist parties in all the European countries. Many of them have been in the government. The Portuguese government, right now the Spanish government is the Socialist Party. Up until 3 months ago, the government of Germany was Scholz, the Socialist Party. Scandinavia used to be called Scandinavian Socialism. When Bernie Sanders explains what he means by socialism, he refers to Denmark. That's the socialism in which the government is very active, very regulatory, taxes a lot, and provides a shitload of public services, but leaves the private capitalist sector pretty much in private hands. Right? That's a kind of socialism. I mean, it's called socialism. Even here in America, people the post office is socialist. They understand the government does something, could be socialist. Stupid, but okay. Americans don't understand this stuff very well. The other sample is the Soviet Union, in which the government comes in and says, we're not going to simply tax. We're not going to simply regulate. We're going to take over. We're going to own and operate the enterprise as a state entity. Okay? Soviet Union did that with its entire industrial apparatus and with a good chunk of its agriculture, too. Not all of it, but a good chunk. State farms, which are different from collective farms, those are private. By the way, what Americans don't understand that Russia never abolished private property, ever. It's always been an important part of their economy, always, and that the state was limited. But relative to anything in the West, the state is a very big player. China didn't do either one of those. China is unique because it's a hybrid. China is 50% state-owned and operated enterprises and 50, not exactly 50, but roughly 50-50 private, all under the control of a powerful government, which is in turn under the control of the Communist Party. That's a unique structure. Russia didn't have that. Russia never allowed half of its industry to be private. And the Scandinavian socialists never allowed their socialism to include an immense governmental sector. In American mentality, it's large because relative to ours, it's bigger, but it was never very significant. That's why there have always been Swedish millionaires, billionaires, and all of that. They've allowed all of that. China now allows it also to be a private sector, includes Jack Ma and other big billionaires. But it's a unique model, not the Soviet. They broke from that. Mao broke from Russia in the late 50s, early 60s on these fundamental questions, opening that space. Other countries didn't do that. North Korea didn't do that. Cuba even didn't do it. Vietnam didn't do it. The Chinese did it. Now Vietnam does it, following the Chinese model, because China is so important and Russia has disappeared. Anyway, that answers your question.
We've spoken a lot today about China and the United States. Where does the collapse of Europe fit into perhaps the demise of the American empire, but also this transition away from capitalism?
Yeah, I think for me, partly as someone whose ancestors are largely European, here's the way it appears to me. I grew up in an environment in which history was presented in the following lopsided way. It kind of starts with Greece and Rome and then evolves into the modern period. And I've been regaled with the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, Athenian democracy, Roman slavery, the Middle Ages, the arrival of the big European states, the clashes that produced colonialism, in which Europe becomes the dominant power on the whole globe and carves up the whole globe among the European nations. That famous conference in Berlin in 1884, when they literally sat in front of a map of Africa and carved up. Germany would get this, and France would get that, and Britain that. And then the explosions that we call World Wars I and II, which were mostly, not all, but mostly European events. Europe is the center. Europe is the dominant. Europe is where I look to learn about literature and science. And now Europe is becoming more and more an unimportant corner of the world. It is becoming what it used to look at the global south as, an unimportant little corner of the world, good for growing bananas or rubber plants or something else. Now Europe is itself becoming a small corner. The modern development of high technology, it's a non-European event. It happens in the United States. It happens in China. It doesn't happen anymore in Europe. The major industries that are growth industries are elsewhere. The industries of Europe are dying, are disappearing, are shrinking. There's a joke that England is on its way back to being what it once was, a cold, wet, offshore island of the continent of Europe. But there's wisdom and truth in all of that. The center of activity, the locus of growth, it's all elsewhere. Europe is less and less important. The war in Ukraine, which is a war in Europe, is being decided by the United States, which isn't in Europe, and Russia sitting down and talking, Russia that has declared itself and its future to be Asian. Literally, people are walking away from Europe. And pretty soon, you're going to see scientific people, artistic people leaving Europe. Europe is going to become a tourist destination and not a whole hell of a lot more, unless they're very careful. This is staggering. This is the relative decline of Western civilization and the rise of, I don't know what we're going to call it, Eastern civilization or Global South civilization. Enormous changes that include the decline of this system, which was a product of Europe's dominance. Capitalism. Begins in England, that's part of Europe. It grows in Europe first. It grows in Europe the most. It enables Europe to take over the whole world and bring capitalism to the rest of the world through its colonialism. But now the rest of the world has begun to take that capitalism, develop it in new ways, and now we are all at the cusp of moving on. Capitalism will have done all it could. Again, Marx's comment, capitalism won't disappear until it has tried every possible way, every form of continuing its life. And we are seeing a range of forms: Anglo-American private capitalism, Scandinavian socialism, Soviet socialism, China socialism with the Chinese quality or as Chinese face. I think we're at the end of that, and I think that the demise of Europe is itself a symptom, a sign, an accompaniment, if you like, to the decline of capitalism. Each of them feeds on the other. Europe is committed to older capitalism. It was, it had the benefit of being there a long time. It had the benefit of its long history, but it also had the burden of its long history. It couldn't adjust fast enough. Very old story. The very capitalism it brings into being then blossoms even more elsewhere than where it was born. That happens. And it was better for European development of capitalism. That capitalism did better elsewhere than it did in Europe. It grew faster in the United States. It's then grown even faster in China, leaving the Europeans behind. Marx's theory of uneven development, there it is. And I think people should dwell on it, because there is nothing so dramatic as the decline of Europe that you see now. It is the only thing more impressive to many of us than the decline of Europe is the denial of the decline of Europe. It is amazing. One watches really minor politicians in the world picture, like Keir Starmer or Emmanuel Macron, talking as if they were the head of the country France and England once were, but aren't anymore. You look at Britain and you see the pomp and circumstance of the coronation of King Charles. There it is. All the drama, all the pomp, all the circumstance of an empire that isn't there anymore. They just have the coach and the horses and the to-do, the simulacrum of what it once was, not the reality. And Mr. Macron, emerging from the Élysée Palace today, one begins to laugh, because you're watching what is either a clown or someone mimicking a clown, or a clown so far gone he doesn't know he's a clown? And that's very funny, except for the French, who are now toying. Half of France wants to believe with him and supports him because he's the symbol. And the other half, like the rest of the world, says, go away, you are anachronistic, leftover, way out of place.
And just like that, the West's hegemony is replaced by the East's.
Yeah.
But now...
Well, no. That's very important. And it's a topic of itself. What comes next? There are two options. There's a choice. The Chinese could become the next empire. And Lord knows there might be a logic to it. They once had empires in China. They have some practice. They have some history. United States, it's de nouveau here. It's all from scratch, from the beginning. But there's an alternative. And the Chinese say, for them, the future is this alternative. And it's a genuine multinationalism. Why not think that the world, might be better off without an empire, any empire, that we shouldn't replace the British with the American with the fill in the blank, that maybe we should learn that precisely because empires go up and then go down, and the going down is painful and difficult and expensive and risky, maybe we avoid that. Maybe we take this moment of the down of the American empire and join with the Chinese. Let's try to set up a genuinely multinational operation. Let's try. We made the first effort with the League of Nations. We made the second effort with the United Nations. They were good. They were not sufficient. Maybe something can be done now when we are self-conscious enough to admit where we are. The UN wasn't created out of a sense of the decline of the British. That was not in the air. That was not spoken. The British didn't believe it. They made the UN before they lost India, etc., etc.
Is it pronounced hegemony or hegemony?
It varies. It depends on who you talk to. The one that I end up using is hegemony.
Hegemony?
But God knows I'm no expert. It could be crazy usage.
Well, we can keep this in the episode.
But hegemony, which is some of my European colleagues, you know where the term comes from, why it's used?
No.
The leader of the Italian Communist Party, Antonio Gramsci, really one of the great intellects that the communist movement in Europe ever produced. And if you're ever interested, somebody you ought to know about. He was a literary critic when he started. Long story short, got involved in the greatest wave of strikes ever to hit Italy against the Turin, the Fiat automobile company, whose basic production factories were in Turin, the north of Italy. And around I don't remember the year, 1912, 1920, somewhere in there, they had unbelievable strikes that built that union, transformed Italy. And the leader of it was this young, sort of artistic man who was remarkable because was born in Sardinia, the island off of the coast, where Corsica is. And he was born with a deformity, which in French is called bossu, in English, hunchback. You know, the bone doesn't go right. And so you're kind of twisted. Little twisted man. But he became a hero in this strike. And shortly there, and he was a member, it's a very complicated Italian history. He was a member of the Socialist Party in Italy already then, as were an enormous, half the young people over 18 years old joined the Socialist Party. Mussolini was in the same party. Mussolini then quit and went to the right. Antonio Gramsci quit and went to the left. When all socialist parties split after World War I, that's when all the communist parties were created in the split. And he split for the left and became a member and joined and became the leader of the Italian Communist Party. After World War II, well, before World War II, the party grew very fast in Italy, really fast. And Mussolini, who went to the right, saw him as the great alternative, as the middle of Italian politics dissolved. That's why it's relevant to us now. It's the same story, for the same or very similar reasons. The middle collapsed, and the right went to Mussolini, the left went to Gramsci and the Italian Communist Party. Early in the 1920s, Mussolini, to handle the situation, arrested Gramsci and put him in jail and kept him there for the rest of his life. While he was in jail, he kept notebooks on, and he remained the leader of the Communist Party in jail. The notebooks were assembled, and they are called the prison notebooks of Antonio Gramsci. It has been an inspiration for people, everybody on the left in the world. There's an International Gramsci Society, for example, very active, headquarters in Rome. Columbia University Press published the complete prison notebooks of Gramsci. And he coined, in order to analyze Italy, he coined the phrase hegemony. And because of its centrality to his analysis of the Italian and broader European situation, it became a term that got picked up. And so that's where it comes from.
I think I first encountered the word in high school. I read a book by Noam Chomsky with hegemony in the title.
Yes.
And I didn't understand very much of that book, but I learned the word at least.
Okay. Well, if you ever want to go to the proverbial horse's mouth, Gramsci is where it comes from. And by the way, he is one of the great of the Marxian tradition. I mean, if you made a list, Marx, Engels, I don't know, Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg, Lukács, and a few, he's right up there.
What makes Gramsci one of the greatest Marxists?
The best way to understand it is Marx himself, right? He dies in 1883. He devotes he's a philosopher. You know, he got his PhD, the equivalent in Germany of a PhD in philosophy. He wrote his doctoral dissertation on Greek philosophy of, 5,000 years ago. And it's as a philosopher, he gets his first job teaching in the university. And he gets caught up, the way students today might get caught up in a pro-Palestine kind of rally or something on the campus. He got caught up in struggles of workers in the cities and towns where he was a professor. Long story short, he shifted to economics, and then he writes the rest of his life, basically, about economics and politics with a deep philosophic background. He is one of the great students of Hegel. He comes out of the Hegelian tradition. He referred to Hegel all his life as my mentor and master. He had criticisms of his teacher, as rightly he should. But he was very angry when people denounced Hegel. He would immediately run and go, "Are you kidding? You don't understand Hegel. You don't get anything I'm doing either." A message to the left. Lenin later, who didn't understand it, late in Lenin's life, he makes a famous quote. Anyone who doesn't read and study Hegel cannot understand Marx. Lenin said that because it's how he came to it. Very famous. Lenin has a whole book. Very few people know it. called the Conspectus on Hegel, in which he writes an immense volume of endless notes on Hegel and how important Hegel was to Lenin's conception of revolution, of society, of social change, and all of that. Now, Hegel is a dead dog in this country. The only places that teach Hegel in any systematic way are Catholic universities, because they kept up the conventional. I wanted to be a philosopher. I mean, when I went to Harvard, I majored in philosophy. I wanted to major in philosophy, but between the horrible way it was taught and my father, who said, "I'll never get a job as a philosopher," I didn't. I went to economics, following Marx. Not that I didn't do it for that reason, but like that. Anyway, Marx writes, it's all Das Kapital. How does capitalism work? It's an economics-y focused. So much of the Marxist tradition that rises up very fast toward the end of Marx's life and really takes off after he dies, the last decades of the 19th century and then the 20th century, which is the spread of Marxism to become global, which it hadn't been before. What also happened was that as it became bigger and bigger, it attracted people whose primary interest wasn't economics, who, think of it this way. They said, "Thank you, Marx, you've helped me understand capital. Now I see how capitalism has fucked up the movies or opera or literature, or how it has shaped our culture." Gramsci is crucial because he's the first one to systematically do that. And what I mean systematically, he's sitting in jail. If my memory is right, he's arrested in 1922 and he dies in 1939. The last few months they let him out of jail. They have made him so sick in jail that he dies of... Mussolini killed him in so many words. But he's sitting there for many years, right? So he can do, written analytical work by force of prison. And so it's an enormous, and he studies, he reaches the conclusion, let me put it to you this way. If you're interested in this, in the Marxian tradition, I used to teach a course at UMass called The History of the Marxian Tradition. There was such a demand, you couldn't hold the students back from all the fields. And all I would do is say, after Marx, let me show you what happened. So Gramsci's genius was to say, and he almost used these words, "I'm jealous of Lenin." He admired Lenin. "I'm jealous of Lenin. He could make a revolution out of the chaos of Russia. We have very similar chaos here in Italy, and we couldn't do it. Why not? What? The objective situation, very similar to Russia. Devastation of war, weak capitalism, wild suffering, and a core of revolutionary. We have that in Italy, and Italy did. Why couldn't it work? Why did the revolution not happen in Italy the way it did in Russia? There were revolutionary upsurges all over Europe after World War I. In Bavaria, they formed something called the Bavarian Soviet Socialist Republic. They even took the name. And for a good while, Munich, the big city in the south of Germany, was the head of the revolutionary government. In Budapest, in Hungary, 2 hours away, the same thing. Georg Lukács, the great thinker, was the Minister of Education in the revolutionary Soviet Socialist Republic of Hungary. You had it in Europe. You had it in Seattle. There was a revolutionary movement in Washington. All over the world this happened. Anyway, in Italy, he asked himself the question, and he reached the following conclusion. It's the culture of Italy. It's the culture, and the way he put it, using Marxian-type language, the objective conditions for the revolution were present. The subjective conditions were not. what was in people's heads, how they understood the situation, was different here than in Russia. And what I'm going to show you, he said, is how that worked. And in order for him to do that, he had to understand the music, the religion, the family customs, and he then devotes himself to studying that. And he's a real scholar, stuck in jail. He had been a theater critic, publishing theater reviews before he got politically involved. And so it becomes the first of the great Marxists to shift over and begin to take that theoretical framework, but apply it not to economics, not even to political things. He talked about politics a lot, but that was not. The notebooks are about culture. And there, for example, you have one of the greatest analyses of the Roman Catholic Church ever, because it's the church he grew up in. It's the Church of Italy. It's the Vatican. I mean, everything's there. So and it's very powerful among the people of Italy. It's been there for 1,000 years or more. And he wants to understand how that ended up being something that blocked a revolution otherwise about to happen from happening. And he does the same for Italian music. He does it for Italian painting. He does it for Italian family life. And so every Marxist since, and many others, have taken their clues from this extraordinary cultural analysis, how to think about these things. It's not so much the particular point he makes, but how he analyzes novels, how he analyzes newspapers in Italy. It's just extraordinary. And here in the United States, it took off in the following way, because it's America, the peculiar way this country works. I'll tell you this way. 20 times in my life, I have been present at some, I've been a professor all my life, so at some seminar, like at Stanford or a place like that. I went to school, I think I told you, I spent a year at Stanford as a student. And there'd be somebody giving a paper on Gramsci or comparing Gramsci to somebody else. And they would go on and go on. And I, given I'm politically active, I noticed this was Gramsci. They footnoted Gramsci. They talked about Gramsci, but they left something out. He's a communist. He's the head of the Italian Communist Party. They had to clean him out. They had to take off his feathers. They could, it's America. They could not handle that's what he was, that he was an important figure in the literature department at their seminar on postmodernism. And there's Mr. Gramsci, as he always was, but he was cleaned up. He was just Mr. Gramsci, an important Italian intellect, not, it's absolutely incredible. I told you, one of the people that I had time with is the Gramsci of France, which is Althusser.
Right.
Althusser is a member of the Communist Party, an activist in the Communist Party, all of his adult life. And he became the rector of something in Paris called the École Normale. That's the highest level of university you can get to. It's like, I don't know, Harvard or Yale or something, like Oxford or Cambridge. So not only is he a professor there, but he's the rector. The rector is the highest official. It's like, we don't have that here, but I don't know, provost or chancellor or some hoity-toity president of the university is an active communist, public active communist, and this is in the 1970s and 80s. Can you imagine here in the United States? I would talk about Althusser. People who know a little bit, they know who that is. He's widely published, and he is The rector at École Normale means you're France's number one philosopher. That officially, that's what you are. But here in America, they knew who he was, but that he was a communist, they did not know. When I would tell them that, they would look at me. They would look at me as if somebody they really admired turned out to have a flatulence problem. They didn't know what to do with the. Very strange. It's very strange about our culture. In Europe, everybody knows. To be a communist or a socialist in Europe is no big deal. Every country has Communist Party, Socialist Party. Everybody's family has Uncle Harry or Aunt Louise who's in the party. And so when they have a family picnic, they have arguments, and nobody's frightened by this. But not here. Here, because you've repressed it, you can then tell stories about it, right. And they can become monsters because who's to refute it? Nobody. So, anyway, that's where hegemony comes from. And Gramsci is the key man.
Each time we sit down for a conversation now, I'm thinking, we're finally going to run out of stuff to talk about. But then we don't even get to my notes at all, so that leaves room for at least another one. So, Rick...
tell me how often you come here, seriously.
I've been coming every couple months, 2 or 3 months. So,
and you fly in and do a bunch of interviews?
I flew in on a red eye last night, so I got in at 5 a.m. this morning, had an interview at 8 for 3 hours.
Jesus.
This one's for 3 hours.
Did you sleep on the airplane?
No, and then I've got one for 3 hours after this.
With Chris?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so it was great, Rick. Until next time.